Okay, so taking a look at the suitcase, it's in Unreal. It is properly scaled. I love to see that. Texture looks pretty complete, and the UVs. I took a look at the UVs. They're looking pretty good, pretty well packed. Not a lot of wasted space there. So yeah, overall, like in terms of the pipeline, I'm really liking how this is being executed. One thing I would mention is like the file names. You probably want to have like a good material slot name, like suitcase, so that your files are named like suitcase underscore base color instead of case underscore low underscore AI standard surface one underscore base color. Would be just a nice thing to work a bit cleaner. But other than that, yeah, nice work with the pipeline stuff. I do want to talk about like something I'm a little unclear on with this prop. So I see your call out here, which is a picture of like a pelican case with material callouts that are incorrect. So I'll come back to that in a second. I have more pictures of sort of some pelican style cases, some other types of cases, and then your case model doesn't look like any of them. It looks like an original design. Now, if you have concept art that you're working from, I want to see that included in the folder here. If you don't, then that's problematic too. I think like because one thing that is missing here is your game reference, like because you're supposed to be picking a game to target the visual style of, and then including that and your reference of it in these uploads, right? Because I don't know if this is meant to be stylized to look like a certain game. If it is, I don't know what that game is. I could try to dig through the many folders on this Google Drive to find one of the folders that has your game reference in it, but that's like kind of asking more of me than I can really do for everybody on the drive. So like, yeah, I don't know what game this is for, and that sort of limits the type of feedback that I can give here. I will say, I think part of the problem here is the design is not very strong. So if it is from a concept art, I would say you probably want to pick like stronger concept art, but also like you should probably be modeling the Pelican case or whatever this thing is, right? This would make a much better portfolio piece than this design. This design has some issues. One of them is like take a look at the handle, right? If I look at the handles on all of these cases, one thing they all have in common is that they're on a hinge. So when the thing is laying down, the handle hangs down to the side pretty much. That's just something that every suitcase ever basically has in common. Like it's very, very rare to see a handle that doesn't have a hinge. A main reason for that is like a protruding handle will get knocked off in transit. Their cases are thrown around, they're moved around a lot, and a handle that is protruding and is like, doesn't bend or give if you push it on it, that's going to probably, there's like a really high chance that'll get knocked off the object. So, when I see this handle that has no hinge and it's sort of sticking off, that looks like sort of, I know you have reference for suitcases, but this design looks like someone wasn't paying super close attention to the reference. So I think if you're going to do an original design, just keep in mind like doing an original design is quite difficult and it requires a lot of observation of your source material, and this feels like it was done pretty fast without like a lot of careful attention to what you're copying. Same with the latches. Like the latches are just boxes essentially. I see there's a bit more detail on the high poly, and there's like they're pressable buttons, which is cool, but that's not really clear when I look at these high poly versions. That looks like a button you could press. It's still less sort of clarity on the mechanism that I would like, but there's at least sort of something going on there. But when I get to this one, the emissive is now sort of washing all that out, and it just looks like a rectangle with a glowing stripe on it, basically. I think in general, the poly count, you've done a pretty good job of keeping this like low poly and not wasteful, which I appreciate. I think these corners, you could weld these edges together, but other than that, like I don't really have any crits as far as use of topology. But I think like for a modern game, you could probably model out a bit more. I would definitely think, these edges are crazy sharp. This is again going back to like I don't know what game you're trying to make something for. In certain games, like I don't know, Psychonauts might have like a really spiky, sharp-edged suitcase, right? But in general, I would say probably a suitcase like this would have somewhat beveled edges, and you would want to represent that in a low poly. Yeah, not knowing what game you're going for and what concept you're working for is a bit difficult because I don't know if you're working out of your head, if you're hitting a concept or not hitting a concept that I can't see, if you're hitting or not hitting a visual style from a game that I'm not aware of. That's I'm not aware of that. So yeah, I would say try to make sure that you're working towards a clear visual style for an existing game and working off of either a fully realized physical object or a really good professional concept because at the moment, yeah, I think this design just is not super strong, and even if the execution is solid, like I think that's letting you down a bit here. Now, looking at the call out too, like generally a call out, you have a call out on a drawing, right? If a drawing isn't super clear about what the materials are, then you have material call outs where you're like, this is what this is, this is what this is, this is what I intended by this. Now, like this is a real object, this is a photo of a real suitcase, and it's confusing me because like this is clearly plastic, not metal. This is clearly foam, not fabric. So like you're just sort of labeling a photo with different materials than are depicted in the photo. So yeah, I think that the process of like conceiving of this object that you're modeling feels incomplete to me. With that being said, like yeah, I think the concept is not working, but the execution is pretty good. All of that is decent. I think you just need to be working from like stronger concepts. The poly count, yeah, like I mentioned, is pretty low. It's definitely lower than it needs to be for something like this. I think like it looks like maybe you were doing some stuff in substance. Now lost the interior stuff that I was looking at. Let's just look at this. Okay, so it looks like there's a tiling sort of diamond pattern on the interior. Like, and if that's intended to represent the foam in the call out, that's like an inch tall and an inch deep. You want to model that out. Like you don't want to try to make that with a normal map. Just doesn't make sense. So modeling this case in this picture would have been a much better call than modeling this guy here because it raises a lot more questions. But in general, in terms of just sort of executing the pipeline of the game prop, I think you're doing a really solid job here. Okay, next I'm going to take a look at the phonograph again. Let's see. So I want to address the notes first. Issues with Unreal, issue with textures, fair enough. Should you paint in lighting like highlights and glare or rely entirely on an overhead light? So do not paint in lighting in an Overwatch prop, I don't think. If you can find anything on ArtStation that's from a real Overwatch artist and you're able to see any of the texture maps, I think that would be great and might answer some of your questions better than I can. But in my instinct would be no, like a lot of Overwatch stuff has like worn edges that are lighter than the rest of the map. So like in that sense, maybe a bit of edge highlights would be acceptable, but like I wouldn't be painting in like a lighter top and darker bottom that's being shaded by like sunlight or anything like that. I don't think Overwatch is doing anything like that. These details, I think yes, I would say you should model those out in your low poly. I think that's a good idea. I would maybe make them a bit bigger, a bit chunkier, because I talked in the last video last week about how like something like Overwatch tends to have a sort of a minimum scale of detail. I think this was in my feedback on the gun. The other thing is anytime you have like something that's basically 90 degrees angle sticking out from your model, it can help the legibility and also the bake if it's a little bit angled, like it's not totally straight up and down on the sides. So like I would consider making those buttons bigger and also like, run that off there and making them a bit shaped more like that. That would be my suggestion for those. These edges in your high poly, yes, those are too hard. I think maybe what I have not realized up to this point is maybe you guys are not familiar with subdivision modeling. So I'm going to tell everyone in the class, you should know what subdivision modeling is. You must find out right now because this is really critical. Here's a video. I'll drop this in the video description or something. But subdivision modeling is a really important way of modeling, and you got to know how it works and what you do in it, right? So this guy's demoing it. I don't know if this is a good video. I think it's pretty good. It looks like a good video from my scrubbing through it. But yeah, basically, I'm in Blender today, so sorry about that. But so here's a cube. If I go to edit on this cube, it's literally just a six-sided cube. In Blender, like in Maya, you press like 4 or whatever button you press to smooth stuff. In Blender, you add a subdivision surface modifier. So I'm doing that. I'm gonna increase the subdivision level real quick here. Now it's a ball, right? Well, I don't want a ball. I want a cube. So like I'm going to disable this for now. And then I'm going to start adding edge loops to this thing. So if I add this and turn this back on, you'll notice that now this end, because basically the subdivision surface modifier, the smooth modifier in Maya, is taking the polygons and adding like extra ones, and then it's just sort of averaging them all together. So it rounds it off, everything gets averaged together and smoothed out. But that means that if you're averaging between like each point, each vertex in each edge, then if these two edges are close together, then the average is going to be like biased towards these two, right? So if I do the same thing on this side, the closer the edge gets, the sharper the edge gets in the subdivided version, in the smooth version. So I can control how sharp of an edge, how sharp of a bevel I'm getting here by the placement of my edge loops. If I add another one, I can make it even more so like that. So basically, if you want something that's pretty hard edged, but not completely hard edged, that's how you start doing these types of bevels. You know, you have basically an edge on each side of the actual edge that's reinforcing it in the subdivision, and it's smoothing as it smooths it out. These edges sort of hold that shape so that you're not getting a big sphere or like a cylinder or whatever. Yeah, so as you can see, I've now added just like supporting edges on both sides of each of the main edges of the cube, and now it doesn't matter how much I subdivide this. If I subdivide this to like 4, it's going to be very high poly, but it's going to hold those sharp edges. So that's the sort of the basis of subdivision modeling. And, you know, a big part of subdivision modeling is controlling like how round do you want those edges to be. You know, maybe for an Overwatch, these edges are already too sharp, even with the subdivision applied. So I'm going to bring these edges further away and start to get a softer, quote unquote, hard edge, right? So now you can see these edges are much softer than the ones on the other sides. Another thing is like the algorithm of smoothing can sometimes, you know, it'll start to smooth things off. As you can see, it's not only rounding out stuff past this edge, it's already starting to round it out on the other side. So if I want to make sure that there's no sort of curvature to this middle area here, I can add another edge loop to reinforce it and say like, no, you're not rounding until you get like to there. Um, so, you know, this is basically what subdivision modeling is. You run into a lot of issues modeling more complex geometry. It's a pretty difficult skill, but it's super critical for modeling to understand subdivision modeling and how to model like this. So like when you're making your high poly, you want to be modeling with subdivision modeling and not like you don't ever want to have these sort of hard edges like this. This is like a low poly type of thing. That's not a subdivision modeling screenshot from what I can see. So just to be clear, like everything you are doing in your high poly should be built like this, unless it's like a ZBrush sculpt, in which case you're probably going to get stuff like this anyway, right? So just to explain that, hopefully that clears things up. I really recommend everybody watch this video because you really do need to know like what subdivision modeling is and how that relates to like your low poly for like a game prop. Beyond that, I have just added a layer so I can see your bake, and I do see a lot of issues happening at the moment. Like if I go down here and look at these, there's a lot of seams happening here. I would encourage you to go back and look at my previous demo because I think I show how to avoid this particular issue. You need to be splitting apart your hard edges in your UV shells because that's going to affect how you bake. But I won't retread the entire thing here. I would just say go back and look at the UVing and baking demo in my previous video because this is definitely avoidable. You can have much better baking results. I would in general for this one because this is an Overwatch thing and there's an Overwatch themed gun somebody else is working on. I would go look at the Overwatch gun feedback from last week because yeah, another thing is like the width of the bevels, the roundness of your hard edges and the fatness of your hard edges and the smoothness or whatever. For Overwatch that needs to be pretty smooth, pretty chunky. And this has a lot of inconsistency like there's these bevels, There's these smaller bevels inside. There's the edge on the record. There's the edge over here, which is like super hard and very thin bevel. So like Overwatch has minimum width for bevels, minimum scale for details. You want to be doing that properly for your Overwatch themed prop. Like this is not baking down well at all, etc. So that's all fixable. Go back and watch the previous demo. I think you will find it super useful. Hopefully, this looks like a mistake. I'm not sure like what's going on here. Like yeah, I don't know where the concept is from, but it is like this is just a circle, and then in here there's like something going on, but it's not a very refined concept. It's pretty roughly sketched, so it's not clear to me what this is supposed to be. But like in general, these don't this looks like a low poly that was just baked into a high poly. I would want to see like, are these pieces of metal that are fitted together? If so, like some of them should be over others. They shouldn't all just be like perfectly flush. I don't see any gaps between them in the bake. Like this doesn't look like a manufactured item, essentially. It looks like just a low poly model. So I would say if this is your concept, like it's a good concept, it's just not like I think you need more information about like how these pieces fit together on the inside of this area here. And yeah, just figure out like what are the metal pieces and model those out in a way that looks like a real object. Also like the record. I'm hoping you're gonna model a bit more detail on the record at some point, because like a record has the music part with grooves on it. It's got a label in the middle, and then there's kind of a, almost a 1 inch no man's land of plastic between the label and the grooves. And then obviously it's got a hole in the middle, and it's got the spindle sticking up through the hole. So at the moment, the record is just a cylinder, and hopefully I think that's something to maybe not do in the high poly, but I think maybe the label and the no man's land is probably worth doing in the high poly, at least a little bit, as like a shallow detail. And then obviously the spindle, you got to have that modeled out. But at this scale of object, if it was really going into Overwatch, they probably wouldn't model out this like this edge paneling. But also like this, the fact that this goes over here, this seam doesn't reach all the way to the next one. Like it doesn't look. It means this is all one piece that just has a notch cut in it, right? So you want to be modeling like persuasively and showing like this is actually made out of different pieces that were assembled together, and not just like one piece that I'm drawing lines on top of, if that makes sense. So that would be helpful, I think, in terms of plausibility. Always with your high poly in particular, obviously with your low poly, you want to have it be very optimized and watertight as much as you can. But with the high poly, you really want to try to model it the way that something was actually manufactured, have separate pieces if they were separate pieces, if they're separate materials. You know, different panels, model those separately and have them fit together, etc. So I think that would help here too. Yeah, good progress. I appreciate the notes, and I hope to see the next one next week. Exciting. Okay, taking a look at the dresser. ZBrush morph target issues. Dude, me too. Literally fighting with ZBrush morph targets earlier. Okay, so two different versions of the low poly. Wondering if one went too far. It's hard to say without the bake. I think it really depends on how it bakes down and how it looks in game, to be perfectly honest. Like I have here an Unreal first person sample project that I just set up. I threw the suitcase in it for earlier feedback, running around in here. So if once you get to the baking stage, I would say like I forget what game this dresser is meant to be like, but if it's a first person game, use the first person sample project. If it's a third person game, use the third person sample project and just throw it in here and run around and sort of be like, hey, is this noticeable? And keep in mind like how close are people going to be standing to it typically? Is it going to be a focus of people's attention? Whatever. So I would just try to look at it in context in that sense if you can. Offhand, the lower poly one looks totally good. Now, this section is super thin and would create thin triangles. Important to keep the shape. So like, I don't think this quad is too thin to keep, but I also don't think it's doing enough to be worth it. In context, like, how close am I going to be standing to this in the game? How close am I going to be looking at it? I think that is something that would probably bake down and would be fine. If this you feel is like an important design element, I might thicken it up so that it is visible to the player. Because I think like even if you keep this quad, I don't think that detail. It's a very shallow, you know, change of the silhouette, and I don't think a player would see that necessarily, unless they were like staring right at that part of the model. So that's something to keep in mind. For my high poly, I mainly used edge loops in Maya. For the sections that added weird creases, I use the crease tool in ZBrush. I mean, for the purposes of this, especially if you're going to be sculpting, wood damage and detail onto it after the fact, I think however you get there is fine. Like I mentioned before, like being a strong subdivision modeler, it's an important skill. So I would try to practice that skill regardless. But in terms of this assignment, in terms of getting to the finish line, I would say whatever makes your high poly look good is okay. Subdivision modeling is a very important first step, but like if you need to pull out some other tools in your toolbox to get to the end, that's totally cool. Okay, so high poly I think is looking pretty good. I'll look at that in a second. I do want to complain about this. This is not 1080p. This is lower than that, scaled up to 1080p. I'm not asking for 1080p as an arbitrary hoop for you guys to jump through. I'm asking for it so I can see. So if you turn in low res stuff that's you've just scaled up, sort of defeats the purpose. So yeah, please, like, if you're taking a screenshot in Maya, at least like drag the viewport as big as you can get it, close all the like side tabs, and then take the picture. This is a 1080p JPEG file. This is not a 1080p render. Come on, I can tell. You gotta render at 1080p. Like, you can't just render lower than 1080p and then increase the size of the image later. Like, I will say, come on. Okay, so looking at this in game, I wanted to show something that I ran into. I don't know if this is an issue that you ran into or you ran into a related one or unrelated one, but just for educational purposes, like I threw all the textures in here, set up a material, and I was like, wait, this is super crazy colors. This is like vaporwave. Was this intended? Is this how it's supposed to look? Because that's like crazy. And I went back and looked at like the Unreal screenshots, and I was like, no, that's orange. It's not pink. What's going on here? And then I remembered I looked at this the base color texture again. And so something that Unreal does is when you import a normal map, it has a few different types of textures. Specifically, if you look in texture group and compression settings, mainly compression settings are the important one. Default is what most things will be. Your base color will be default, but your normal map, generally Unreal will auto detect that it's a normal map and compress it as a normal map, and that'll just change when you throw a texture into the material editor. If I click on this texture sample, Unreal mistakenly thought this base color map was a normal map, maybe because it was mostly blue. I'm not really sure, but it did. And the texture samplers here are actually, they have different sampler types. So this one is a normal map. This one is a linear color. So basically, linear color means it's a color map or masks map with sRGB turned off. Color means sRGB is turned on, which is what you would get for your base color. Now, this is a sampler type of normal because it thinks it's a normal map. This is also set to normal, but this actually is a normal map, so that's good. So this is bad. Now, when I go back to the base color texture, what I can do is I can change the texture group to world and change the compression settings back to default and save that. However, now the sampler is going to be mad at me because it's set to normal, and it shouldn't be because the texture is now set to, default. So if actually, sorry, forgot one thing. When it switches something to a normal map and sets up the normal map settings automatically, it's also going to turn sRGB off. So turn sRGB back on because you want it on for a base color texture. Now this is good. Now I'm going back here, and what I'm supposed to do is set this to color. Once I set the sampler type to color, it's going to be good. The other thing I could have done if this was set to normal, I could just delete it. And now that I've fixed the texture, I can just throw the texture back in. It will automatically set up the sampler correctly. So this is looking good in game, I think. I don't know, frankly, what this pillowy normal thing is that's happening here. It looks like your low poly normals were just not imported correctly, and I'm not sure what's going on with that. If you're able to like reliably reproduce this in 5.5, let me know, and I can definitely like try it out myself and see if I can figure out why that's happening. But yeah, I guess for the time being, like this does seem like the model is correct, the textures are correct, so I don't know why that would happen. It's up to you if you want to try to track that down or just go with an older version of Unreal. In any case, let's see. I'm just going to look at the bake in game for now. Overall, in fact, like pretty much totally, I think this is very good. I think this is turning out super good. Lack of detail on the back, but maybe if this is a mailbox that's always up against a wall, that's not really an issue. I actually don't have much in the way of critiques for execution at this stage. I think this is all coming together really well. I think focusing on the technical issues probably is all you really need to be doing at this point, and probably working on the base color. This is pretty good at this point. I might look at Overwatch stuff and see how they treat like logos and text and stuff, and see if there's a bit more of a painterly, like messy edge to it. But if that's not the case, then you're all good. You know, maybe the logo and the stripe could get painterlyized a bit more. This here, I don't know if this is supposed to be a screen or not. It sort of seems to be painted as if it was a screen, but it's not, like, doesn't have an emissive thing set up or anything. These lights look a little bit rough. Would love to see some emissive on those. But other than that stuff, like, this is coming out really, really nicely. So nice work. This definitely looks like Overwatch. I think very successful in that regard. The modeling is strong. If I ran past this in an Overwatch match, I would probably be like, "Yep, looks right to me." So nice work. Yeah, I would just focus on refining the textures and material, and yeah, like if you can add some. Honestly, like this panel and these might be worth modeling out. Is my only feedback. Like down here, you have it modeled out. I think maybe having these more like that would be great. But otherwise, yeah, this is looking really good. Nice work. Okay, looking at this, I think good job addressing the feedback. I think this is looking way more Overwatchy in terms of proportion and thickness of details and stuff. The bevels, I guess maybe I'm not being super clear. These should be like round edges. I think you have them some places, like here it's round partly, but then sharp at the front. These need to be like fully rounded off, like all these bevels. I would treat those. Oh, nice job with the handle. That is now holdable by a human hand, although it's still pretty flat in the front, but way better, way better. I guess I'm not being super clear when I say bevel, but like for a subdivision modeling pass on a hard surface object, the bevel is usually like round. It's not like a hard bevel. Definitely soften stuff like this. This should be round and not flat on the corners. Pretty much everything should be like that in terms of like the Overwatch style. Like there can be actual like actual bevels that are faceted, but then the like transitions between those facets need to be like, like you have here, rounded off. But the hard edges need to be rounded off, like at a large scale. So I think you're definitely heading in the right direction. It's just maybe a miscommunication here. Some of the sub-D modeling, I think you're getting smoothing errors here. You're getting issues here. It looks like it's not super bad, but over here, definitely bad. You wanna clean up your sub-D modeling in these areas so that you're not getting those smoothing errors. But like really, really great improvements on the high poly here overall. I think it just needs some adjustments, and then it's banger. Looking belatedly over your notes, everything here looks really good. I think bringing up the color from the like pitch black of the reference is a really good call. That'll be more PBR accurate, and I think these are really good references for that. And I see you're still working on the high poly, so that's cool. I obviously gave feedback on that already. In terms of the handle, you can shape this that way. I think that would be cool. I think if you're gonna change the silhouette of the handle in that way, then maybe the right one I think looks better to me. With that being said, like you probably want to look up pictures of the Mac 10, which I would guess is probably the main reference for this gun. And obviously, a lot of these are video game models that you don't want to use for reference. That has a very square handle, similar sort of machine pistol design to the one you're making. So yeah, I would just like note how the front of it is rounded off. Like the profile is definitely a bit wonky, and like if you look at the Mac 10, it's more the shape of the back half of the handle that creates a comfortable space for the hand to hold. But like the front is rounded off so that your fingers can wrap around it, and I think that's really what I was complaining about before. Is like it's still very flat on the front here. It should be round. You have it beveled here. It should still be rounder than that, but like that's a shape that a human hand can wrap around. The front part is still very flat. So this is basically from this angle is where I want it to be round rather than like necessarily changing the profile of the handle. Although yeah, like I said, maybe looking at the Mac 10 profile and making the handle something like that would be good, but it's sort of up to you. I do think it's now the handle's looking a little bit like short. Again, like this is really just about ergonomics. it might be easier for a person to hold if it was like a little longer, like that. It doesn't have to be perfect. Ignore this. Jesus Christ. It just needs to be like roughly handle shaped, and I think you're getting there already. So yeah, nice work, and I think you're definitely on the right track with this thing. Okay, so looking at the well, I'm not sure how to say this, but these UVs are the opposite of what I was intending. Um, I have to be honest, I don't really remember how to UV in Blender. So what I'm going to have to do is try to explain using Photoshop what I would like to see UVs wise. So if you're UVing a cylinder, the good and appropriate and correct way to UV the cylinder is to UV the top and perhaps the bottom, if there's a bottom, you know, as flat planes. And then the side of it, you want to make one seam, maybe two seams, in certain cases more, but in general, no more than two seams. And then you want to flatten it out, right? Around the side. That's going to give you the least amount of like UV distortion throughout all of this. What you don't want to do is leave it with no seams and then like try to UV it as like a donut, a flat donut shape. And obviously, if you cut like a partial seam and UV it like this, as you've done here, that will reduce the amount of distortion, but it's still way more distortion than you get from just UVing it as essentially a rectangle. So I guess maybe I did a really bad job explaining it last time, and I apologize for that, but like you want to be doing the top thing. Let me use some check marks and X's here. This is good. This is bad. I think these UVs have unfortunately gone in like the wrong direction, which is a shame because everything else here is going super well. The texturing pass is looking really awesome. You know, the sculpt is great. So like I hate to belabor this, but like yeah, don't UV it like this. UV it like a like that, and you'll get less distortion. You'll have less to fight with when you're texturing it. I think in this case it would be worth doing it again. Like basically, let me take a look at the screenshot and try to imagine a UV sheet for it. So I'm going to seam this out in my own mind. So like obviously the top, that's a seam there. And there's another seam around the inner edge. And so that lays out to a UV shell that's like that. Now I'm looking at the outer side and I do see that there's a divot in there. But my judgment is that that divot is not a huge deal. If it was super deep, I might split it out at that edge, right? I might create a seam here and here in the silhouette. But I think this is too small to be worth it. So I'm going to obviously put a seam down at the bottom. Like you did before, I think this was correct. It's totally cool to hide a seam underneath these wood pieces. So if the seam is hidden behind the wood piece, then you can now have two shells, which makes it easier to pack your UVs, easier to move this around, right? In this case, you would want to have two seams. This part here, don't worry about that. That's part of this shell. You don't need it to be a separate piece. So that's good, right? We've now done that. And then for the inside, probably maybe one seam in there. Here, I'll represent this seam with a dotted line and the inner one as well. So the inside, I've now got maybe one piece, but probably as long as I'm packing my UVs this way, I'll put a second seam on the other side. So I'll actually have two of these pieces. So I have now 4 rectangular boxes of UVs for the inside and outside, and I've got this donut on the top. Presumably the bottom doesn't need to be UV'd because that's sticking through the ground. And then obviously you do your wooden posts, which I think you already did, and I don't really have an issue with those. And the reason that you want these improved UVs is that like if you look at this, there's like a really weird distortion happening here. I can see it. There's like a spiral happening almost with this detail. And that would be cool if this was some weird alien thing, but um, for a normal well, you don't want to draw attention to like weird spiraling shapes. You want this all to be pretty even on the inside. So I think improving the UVs would be a really big important step with this one. Besides that, the material work on the rocks looks really good. The blood I have issues with. I'll come back to that in a second. The wood, it looks here. So like again, I talked about this before. You want your material work to follow the grain. I see wood grain that's not following the sculpt, right? I see that happening. Maybe you're still going to come back to that. This is not following the grain. It should be going this way. Up here, it gets really bad. So like I did talk about how to deal with this in the last video. So if that wasn't clear or anything, or if you need more explanation, please let me know because I'd be happy to like demo it out more exhaustively. Same thing happening over here. This is not what you want. This is not what you want. This part here, it looks really good, so that's great. But like basically, this entire area is not working. This isn't working. This isn't working. This all looks good at this resolution. I can't see very much of it, but that's looking pretty decent. And then the blood. Okay, right. I was talking about the blood. So it's flying out like that and like that and like that. Now this is going out a lot. Here it's dripping down, but everything out here is not dripping down. It's like just going straight out and then stopping. So I think like you probably want less splatter outward and more like dripping around the cobblestones here, stuff like that. Also, I might be wrong. It kind of looks like you use the like substance particle liquid brushes. If you did that, don't do that. They're terrible. They suck. You definitely want to just like paint this out by hand. So maybe I'll go over this a bit. Take out some of the like really extreme spreading out to the side stuff. Try to paint out the like the physical nature of it. Like I got into this a bit last week, but really Substance Painter will give you a lot of tools to get out of painting things by hand, and it's almost always a trap. Like you're always going to get a better result if you just do things by hand. Like already running between the bricks, that's like spooky and gross, right? It's nasty. I may have overdone it here, but like that's already starting to look more like blood running down than sort of this sort of outward splatter, because the outward splatter is going to be affected quite a lot by these deep stone grooves and stuff. I think that's good. And also, yeah, I think like if the blood's up here on the top, just from a storytelling and sort of drama perspective, one thing that I didn't mention is like this blood is much brighter than the other blood. I'm not sure why that is. It seems like presumably all the blood got here at the same time. So like, as it oxidates or whatever, it's going to get darker. But anyway, that's not what I was getting at. If the blood is up on the top here, it's probably going to run down inside, right? And if you have it up on the top and it doesn't run down inside, it's sort of like disappointing. You know what I mean? I would say it'll be much more dramatic if, on the other side, on the inside here, you have the blood running down into the well as well. I think that'll be cool. But yeah, like once again, where it is working, where the grain is aligning, like here, that's great. The wood material stuff is great. I think all of the stonework, setting the UV stuff aside, like this all is excellent. So you're very much on the right track with this. I think just fixing the UVs, working on the wood grain directionality and the like blood splatter, I think is the stuff to focus on right now, and you're going to have a really really nice asset. Also, I don't know what happened to the cross beam. I would love to see that come back if it's possible. If not, that's okay, I guess. But it really does help the silhouette of the well. I think without the cross beam, it looks like an incomplete idea a little bit. But other than that, yeah, I think you're doing a lot of really good work here. So thumbs up for that.